Welcome back to the show, everyone. Craig here. Jonah's not with us today, but we have Thomas Polega back. Welcome, Thomas.
Hi, how is everybody doing?
Very good. We kind of hyped this up a little bit on Twitter. I didn't get any personal messages or anything like that. If you did, let me know. But um, we're here today. It's the political season, and Thomas and I were chatting before we got on that I saw on Twitter just within the last hour that sounds like Ron DeSantis has dropped out, and it's Trump versus Nikki Haley. I don't know if any of the other people out there are sniffing at Trump or not. My sense is they are not. But um, so anyway, I wanted to get Thomas on because he and I have had some interesting discussions off the record about um, war and foreign policy, which is I think gets short treatment in a lot of discussions, especially in Catholic circles. We're all taught to care only about abortion and approach the um, voting from that standpoint. And I, for a while, have had a little bit of different perspective on that. I know Thomas does as well, even though we're probably not exactly the same. But before I get into that, I want to make one quick reference. So we got episode 200 coming up, probably within a couple of weeks. Episode 200 is going to be on other acts. So not birth control, not other stuff, but other acts between married couples, what the church does and doesn't teach on that. And I've been beating the pavement, so to speak, the Twitter pavement everywhere else for someone willing to come on and talk about that, and if possible, defend what I would say is more the traditional position on it, have come up empty. And so I'm going to threaten people, if you don't come on, I'm going to have Thomas on, and he's going to have to tangle with me, and we may not be all that far apart from each other on that issue. So teaser for people. But I do want to say, on the way here, I was listening to your interview with, is it Kevin? I don't know what his last name is. Non-Tradicath is his
Not trying to
YouTube.
catch the name he goes by on the YouTube. So
Yeah, I got to get his contact information from you, but I was listening to that on contraception. I'll link to that below, or I'll have Andy link to that below. And I thought that was a tremendous interview. I really, really enjoyed that. Um, and I would love to have that conversation with you again sometime, but that's for a different day. But I do
yeah,
want to encourage people, if they get a chance, they should definitely check out that discussion, especially prior to our episode 200. So anyway, enough of that. Um, I told Thomas, I said, "Hey, let's talk about war," and he was happy to do that, in part because I had heard you give an interview over on, I think it was CVS podcast, maybe a month or so ago, and you spent a lot of time talking about that. I was like, wow, no one in Catholic circles talks about this, and it's something that for me is near and
uh,
dear to my heart because I'm a former former Republican. Like, you voted for the pro-life president, and and I became a Ron Paul Republican in the early 2000s, and it was two big issues: the foreign policy or war, and the drug war, both of which, once I started studying it, caused me to, like, for the first time, really question my worldview and how I had grown up assuming things were supposed to be. And I would say in some ways led me to eventually start talking about some of the things we talk about on this channel relative to Catholic teaching. Um, but so I've been sort of off in the wilderness for a while now, tangling with third parties. And I guess in full disclosure, I'm a registered libertarian. If people are
okay.
wondering, I'm not married to that, but and I know people have sent in messages about the American Solidarity Party and some of these other things, which I think are fine.
I get the same message about this too.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I'm definitely not affiliated with one of the main parties. Doesn't mean I never vote main party, but I'm a fan of third parties. Just so in case people are wondering what my personal views are. So, um, one of the things that really, I guess, frustrated me for so long, in part because I never thought Roe v. Wade was going to be reversed. I thought there was no way. Like, Roe v. Wade's going to be here forever. The longer it goes on, the longer it's going to be here, and it's just going to dominate politics. especially Catholic politics, and getting anyone to entertain a conversation about war and foreign policy when we've got to get Roe v. Wade reversed first, just made it impossible to have these conversations. And I
Which I
started
would
to
like to
question.
kind of interject
Yeah,
slightly
go
in.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the pro-life, pro-choice, situation didn't just do that with foreign policy. It did it with all
Yeah,
policies. There's
yeah.
this idea that, you know, all concepts about good government, right? Because that's ultimately what politics is about. Um, None of those can be discussed or talked about or addressed or engaged with really because there's one pro-life party, and so it's like a ride or die, mentality.
Mhm. Well, and I know even like it seems so long ago, I guess, but it hasn't been that long ago, but like 8 years ago when Bernie Sanders was pretty popular,
Mm.
I told all the Bernie Sanders people, I said, if he would just adopt a softer position on abortion, I think he'd be unbeatable. Like I don't like I think his whole approach to social welfare and all that, if he could just scoop up some of the pro-life vote, I thought he would be impossible to beat. I For a long time I thought that the Democrats made a strategic decision mistake to adopt such a hardline position on abortion, because I thought if they tweaked it a little bit, they could have neutralized the Republicans. In Joe Biden, for example, I thought, he's close, but if he would just say, "Look, my personal views is that abortion's wrong, but I don't necessarily believe that the government is the best vehicle to limit abortions or reduce them," which is kind of
Which
my
real
view.
quick,
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
real quick, he's actually made several public statements, just to that effect that, he believes that, all abortion of any kind, publicly, he said this, is wrong, and that, like, he has this personal moral
Mhm.
conviction as a Catholic.
Yeah,
The
but
media doesn't like to talk about it though, so
yeah,
it
I
gets
mean,
buried.
if he'd have taken just a little, taken that and said, "Look, I don't think that there is a fundamental right to abortion, but I also don't think that the government invading this space and like, I mean, how do you even police that? Every woman that's pregnant, do they have to give random blood tests? And why did why are you no longer pregnant?" Like I always thought, you know, the blind spot to me, really in both political parties, but the Republicans especially, are very skeptical of gun control and background checks and all this. Well, they're not. We don't want the government doing that, and even if they did, they're not that effective and whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I think that's right. So why are you so convinced that if we just pass legislation against abortion, that it's going to be this perfect? They're going to only find the bad actors. It's not going to cause harm to someone that, let's say, God forbid, had a miscarriage. Like there is just this strange inability, I think, on both sides of the political party to be very skeptical of government when they don't want the government to doing something, but then see it as this perfect actor when it's, taking out the drug, enforcing drug laws or gun control, whatever the case may be. I always thought that was such a
Yeah, there's
strange
a
mindset.
schizophrenic, notion about, society and government with
Mhm,
both of those issues, and by the way, we actually know the answer to, like, how effective total bans are,
mhm,
right? Because we have total bans in lots of countries.
mhm,
For example, many, although definitely not all, many in Latin America have total bans on abortion. And specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, where they have, it's like almost a universal. And yet, like in sub-Saharan Africa, you have the highest abortion rates in the world.
mhm,
And so, it's really simple. It's just it actually is just like the drug, the war on drugs, right?
mhm,
Um, you can crack down with like the full force of government, but people are gonna do what they're gonna do. This
mhm,
is not like zoning laws,
mhm,
right? Where people avoid violating these civil statutes because they're like, well, it's just not worth my time to deal with, the civil authorities and the fining and all this kind of stuff to build a pool in my backyard. I think I should have a pool in my backyard. But the government says no, and it's just too difficult. And so those kinds of laws actually work extremely effectively. The level of like civil violations is shockingly low. Um, Now when it comes to like criminal law, like,
Mhm.
stealing or murdering or assaulting people, rape, all these like, traditional, proper crimes, you know, c- uh, when we use the full power of the state, right? First and foremost, it's acknowledged that these things are still going to happen,
Mhm.
right? If we outlaw burglary, we don't believe that burglary, um, laws are going to prevent burglary.
Right.
However, one of the differences is the motivation. So there are people who steal because it's for finances,
Mhm.
really, right? Like, why do you steal? Well, I'm poor and I don't want to, you know, get, whatever it is you want to get, like a normal means. And so you steal. So it's a very practical kind of application. And so when you have strong enforcement of it, it reduces that crime rate quite significantly. Um, and the same thing with when it comes to murder, right? The vast majority of murder that like when people have murderous thoughts, right? It's for some gain of theirs, right? Like
Mhm.
my life would be improved if this person no longer existed.
Mhm.
Now, crimes against murder work very effectively at deterring those people because the consequences are so high. And it's like, well, it's not worth my bother. And people aren't, this is another thing. People aren't addicted or like like there are ways, right? Like to get away from stuff. Like there's alternative avenues to solve these problems. When it comes to things like drugs and like abortion,
Mhm.
they are different, but they're also very similar. With the drugs, like people are addicted,
Mhm.
right? And so they're not making a rational, cost benefit analysis. They might do that in like, well, they're not going to go, smoke weed out in the street.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, well,
You still be smart about it.
yeah, right. Yeah, you're not going to be like,
Yeah.
an idiot. Um, but with the drugs, like the people who do make rational calculations are drug dealers,
Mhm.
right? So, you might be addicted to drugs, and so you're not thinking straight, right? You're doing whatever it is you gonna need. And it doesn't matter what the civil penalties are. Like you're
Mhm.
gonna seek out these drugs anyways.
Mhm.
Um, I think it's also another important thing is that like using drugs isn't a crime. It's a mental health issue.
Mhm.
And you can't decriminalize insanity
Mhm.
or addiction. It
Well,
doesn't work that way.
and in some ways you further it because, of course, people say, "Oh yeah, legalize marijuana," but certainly you can't be for legalizing heroin. And and I think the opposite is true. When you when heroin, something like that, someone has a true that's a medical issue for the most part. If they're coming out getting help is potentially going to lead them in prison, they're not going to seek help. Like, right? Like we should encourage people, make it easy for people to get help, and legalize criminalizing, especially harshly, it just disincentivizes people that need the help from getting the help.
Yeah. And we actually know the results of this. So like Portugal was the
Hmm.
really the first one who like were like, hey, you know what? We have a lot of these sociological theories
Yeah.
about how to deal with this. And by the way, like Portugal had one of the highest like heroin usage rates in the world. It was a massive problem. And people were basically desperate, right? They're like, okay, the current system is catastrophically failing, and so we're willing to try anything. And so they decriminalized. Now, it's important to note that like decriminalization is not legalization.
Hmm.
So you can't have like heroin lollipops sold at the gas station.
Hmm.
That's not what that means, right? And
Hmm.
that's an important distinction, right?
Hmm.
So it's it's just like if you are caught using and consuming heroin, right? Like there's no criminal penalty for that, or civil penalty or fines or any of that stuff. And what they did is they took the massive budget, because that's the thing is like the war on drugs costs
Yeah.
enormous,
Mhm.
like almost mind-alteringly huge amounts of money.
Yep.
From the military industrial complex to the police to all the equipment to the training,
Hmm.
right? I mean, it's a very expensive process.
Hmm.
And they took all of that money away from the police and they gave it to rehab. So, they didn't increase taxes or anything like that. They just transferred, where the funding went. And so instead of, using the money to get guys, automatic machine guns and bulletproof vests and armored vehicles, we went to pay therapists to help these people who are severely addicted. They're like, "Hey, I need help." Right? Like, I have a problem. Because, by the way, not all people who are addicted to drugs think it's a problem,
Hmm.
but most of them do.
Yeah. Most of them don't want to do it necessarily if they,
They
yeah.
they're I mean, that's almost the definition of being addicted,
Yeah.
right? Is that you're doing something repetitively and you can't stop. Like,
St. Paul said something about that. I do what I would want. I keep doing what I don't want to do. And, I mean, it's the
and
human condition.
well, this is one of the things that I actually really liked. It's one of my favorite things from Bishop Barron of all time is that, he said that, for the modern age, right? Really the best translation of what sin is addiction, right? Sin is addiction, right? We were talked about like the yoke, right, of Christ
Mhm.
and the yoke of the devil, right? And like sin as an addiction, that is the heavy yoke, right? Like I'm trapped in this and I can't escape. Um, and I think this kind of like transitions well into our conversation about like what is the responsibility of the state, right? So you had said, in our own personal conversation that you're not a pacifist, which, by the way, good. um, it's actually really my belief that, like as a secular person, and I don't mean religious people, but like as a secular person and being Catholic, you can't be pacifist and have like a coherent, connection with church teaching, right? Church teaching is very clear that war is a legitimate usage of the state. Now,
Mhm.
that's different than saying like, how should it do this? Right. So we talked about this discussion of like drugs, right? Like, well, when we crack down, a good example we have here in the United States, we fought the drug war for like almost
Mhm.
60 years now.
Mhm.
And more people are addicted to drugs than ever before.
Mhm.
And we've dumped quite literally trillions of dollars like down the toilet, just eh, who knows where it's gone. Actually,
Not to mention all the societal cost of people being in jail,
oh,
kids growing up without primarily fathers, but mothers as well. I mean, just
catastrophic. I live in a poor, multi-ethnic neighborhood, right? And I have, for a great deal of my life, I didn't get to live in suburbia. I was raised there, but most of my, life has been outside of that. And so I got to kind of like see the experience of this kind of pretty directly. And, the just horrible systemic problems that are caused by, all of these men being extracted from their communities, from their families, just wreaks absolute devastation on, these poor communities. And that's something that, as catastrophic as it is here in the United States, right? We also see it in Latin America,
Mhm.
where it's drived up to 11, where the war on drugs has basically destabilized and put Latin America, behind in development, an unfathomable amount because right, when drugs are illegal, Americans every year are sending raw cash of billions and billions of dollars to the worst
Mhm.
imaginable people.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, obviously terrorists are bad, and like dictators are bad. Um, but the drug cartels in Latin America are, you know, a special kind of twisted. These really are some of the worst people out there. These are people who just go around and kill and rape for fun. right? And that's like an important, and these aren't people who just like, oh, it's a small criminal gang. Like they have co-opted entire countries, right? I mean, there's
And,
no law and order in these countries anymore. Because they're owned by the cartels.
and they have their power precisely because of the drug war, because it's criminal to
The
grow it
only
here,
reason.
right? So I don't know that people appreciate that relationship is like, yeah, the reason if if you don't have to like to do this to make this under, secrecy and stuff like that under illegal circumstances, you don't need the cartels. I mean, it doesn't mean they won't exist, but that's what
It just
they have the monopoly. Like
goes
they're
away. Yeah.
doing it because people want it. Like
And
having
they're
the
going to
drug war
pay
doesn't.
any price.
Yes, and so I wish people could see the relationship in like you said, all of those are costs of the drug war, and then you looked at and you say, okay, what have the gains been? Like, what have we gotten like out of the approach?
A sense of moral superiority
Yeah,
and the oppression of the poor and
yeah,
colored communities.
yeah, yeah.
That is what has been achieved, right? I mean, this is kind of like, the drug war is perpetuated because it reinforces white supremacy in one of the most
Mhm,
effective ways possible.
mhm, mhm,
It
mhm,
has kept, minority populations, you know, so far back,
mhm.
and it's created these systemic problems, which then of course reinforces our own prejudices
Yeah,
against.
right.
You're like, oh, look how terrible you are, and your communities are a mess. Like,
Yeah,
you must be the problem.
yeah,
Oh, and it's like,
yeah.
well, who's doing that to them?
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
and that's why when and this is going to connect to our issue with abortion, right? So, abortion and the war on drugs came into existence as political like theories and like really pushed right after the ending of segregation. And if we look back to, when we had slavery, right? And slavery ended, right? That did not change hearts and minds fundamentally, right? It
Hmm.
changed the political reality.
Hmm.
And so you couldn't be an American, be like, well, I'm pro-slavery,
Hmm.
right? Like that was just a non-starter conversation, after the Civil War. And so, but people still had these feelings, right? These sentiments and political attitudes. So they had to come up with something new to galvanize those same people who supported slavery into a political group and then affect policy that helped create the world in their preferred vision.
Hmm.
And that's where we get, all of the segregation laws. I mean, segregation was the political answer to the ending of slavery, right? Like, well,
Hmm.
we can't enslave people anymore.
Hmm.
So we're going to create this, enforced segregated society. We're going to strip
Hmm.
away the voting rights of people of color. We're going to create, a good example is like the sunset laws, and these are non-criminal things that are prosecuted as like crimes,
Hmm.
not like civil violations, right? Like, like one of the good examples of like the sunset laws, right? Like you couldn't sell apples after sunset.
Hmm.
That's not a crime.
Right.
That's not criminal activity. Now, it might be a civil violation, right?
Pay a
You're like,
fine or something. Yeah.
yeah, we're like, well, just like you can't sell, your apples on the sidewalk, right? But that's not a crime. That's like a civil violation. And we're
Hmm.
like, well, we tell them, hey, you gotta like leave, and like we might fine them,
Hmm.
right? We're like, hey, here's $100. You have to pay this fine.
Yeah.
Um, and so they created these non-crimes and
Hmm.
turned them into crimes. So that and it was always designed to be, they were very loose interpretation. And so that allowed racist prejudices to enter into the enforcement. So if you were a white man selling apples after sunset, the cop would be like, well, I'm giving you a warning, right?
Hmm.
But if it was a black man who was selling apples after sunset, they could be prosecuted to the full extent of the law and end up going into the prison system, which, after slavery, is what replaced slavery, is because now we have these because in the Constitution, slavery is still legal in the United States. It's very important to realize this. However, you are only allowed to enslave people if they commit a criminal act and therefore are
Mhm.
prisoners.
Yeah.
Right? So prisoners can be forced into slavery. And so what it was is we'd create these fake crimes, prosecute them selectively, take these men, and then the Constitution allowed us to then enslave those people and provide gang chain like free cheap labor, for the community. Um, and eventually segregation ended, right? It became politically like, wow, like separate but equal is actually a fraud, right? Because there is, right? Like it's a nice sentiment when you just say it, right? Just like all men are
Mhm.
equal,
Mhm.
right? You're like, okay, that's who's against separate but equal, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
how could that be bad,
Mhm.
right? Um, and besides, black people don't want to spend, they don't want to live with white people. They want to live in their own community with their own people, right?
Mhm.
And so we can live harmoniously together but apart, right? And this is the whole kind of like marketing. Of course, the reality is this was an apartheid oppression, right? Where we ghettoize, people of color who already have like no access to, education and capital and resources and businesses and markets and all these other things. So we corner them off, um, and we call it equality. However, segregation ended, and then we transitioned into the next stage. And the next stage was abortion and the war on drugs.
Mhm.
These were policies on rallying cries to get pro-segregationists on board as a political group. It's like, how can we perpetuate white supremacy, right, without being able to support segregation? Because that's off the table now. And the war on drugs is like the most nakedly obvious one, right? Where again, the great thing about drug enforcement is that you can do it very selectively, right? If a rich white kid from the suburbia, gets pulled over because he's like, swerving around, you're like, have you been drinking, sir? And you do a breathalyzer and like, oh, you're good. And it's like, well, yeah, can you smell the marijuana? Right? He wasn't drinking, he was smoking. That's why he's a danger to the community. And so we can allow that to get off. Same thing is, with the legal system, right? Obviously, the more lawyers you have, the more money you have, you can find all the loopholes and ways to rationalize. And so this is why, communities of color are prosecuted at astronomically higher rates for drug usage to today, even though the drug usage for whites and blacks are about equal. Like
Do
there's
you
very
think
little difference.
do you think because I kind of want to segue back to the war issue
Yeah.
because of this. Do you think that because I guess in part, like I didn't grow up in the South, like I grew up in the Midwest. Now,
Right.
granted, we're
Same.
we're not very culturally diverse here, but I didn't grow up seeing. I mean, I guess I didn't see prejudice much because we just didn't have, let's say
There's no
blacks,
one
for
to be
example,
prejudiced
around here.
against.
Right, right. So, so for me
Yeah.
to like, I don't think I'm prejudicial. I mean, I don't know what that feels like to have that. Do you think that this is very purposeful and intentional that they're kind of perpetuating, like say, the war on drugs, or is it more this implicit bias that we talk about? What do you think?
So I think today, the most of it is an implicit bias.
Hmm.
And we have a kind of version of separate but equal uh, zeitgeist that we have today, right? And this is this idea, right? Like that everyone should be treated by the same standards in society,
Hmm.
right? This is where like Republicans will like, well, the real racists are Democrats because they want to treat people of color differently
Hmm.
than people who aren't. And see, that's not equal, right? And so everyone needs to be treated under the same letter of the law. However, in practice, of course, like that never happens, right? It's the same thing, separate but equal. It sounds good in theory, But like when we see the actual application of it, we see grave systemic injustices. And, a lot of our biases, and I think this is like an important thing to, we can take this out of just the context of America. This is actually a universal kind of
Mhm.
thing, is that, um, you know, most people, like almost all in groups, that's right. Like this is the us, right? Who is us, right? This is my in group. Um, our ethical, attitude is that like, well, we should do things that's good for us, right? So if something is good for us, then it's a good thing. And we just don't talk about the other, right? And so we don't even enter into the process of like, well, yes, this would be advantageous to my community, but like, what would the effects be on other communities? To just take them into consideration, right? And so a lot of racism and tribalism and, party ideological, all these, kinds of isms and things like this, most of their bigotry and, et cetera, is really based on a non-consideration of the other,
Mhm.
right? Like they just don't exist, right?
Right.
You could imagine, right? Like if you ran your household according to exactly what it is you thought was best for your family, right? Like you're not actively like, oh, I hate my wife, I'm, bigoted towards her, I'm bigoted towards my kids. You're just like, well, I only consider what it is I think is good for everyone. And then you never talk to your wife or kids.
Mhm.
You can see how that would immediately devolve into a system of injustice. Even
Mhm.
honestly, and I would argue, even if you have the best intentions.
Yeah. So one thing, and I forgive me if I throw this grenade into your side. I think I gave you a heads up I was going to ask you
Go,
about
let's
this,
do
but
it.
all right, because I'm I'm very scared about talking about this issue just because I know how. But let me go back to the Civil War because it comes up and you get people fighting about what were they fighting about, what were the Confederates about, and personally, I feel like I'm too ignorant to know. But one of the things that struck me is on the question about how much of slavery was the motivation for the Civil War on either side, and how much of it was sort of the political atmosphere and whatever that was going on. My and I maybe I'm wrong, but like I said, I think it's one thing to have either an implicit or just an express bias against other races, to even going so far as to acknowledge that I'm putting people in prison, whatever, but we're not killing them. That's one thing to sort of carry out those kinds of injustices in the name of my racial prejudice is one thing. It seems like a quite a leap to say, you know what, I'm willing to go out and die in a battlefield. I'm willing to send my son or daughter, but let's say my son to
Wow.
die either to keep people enslaved or vice versa. Am I willing to go die in battle to
To
keep
free.
someone from being enslaved? Like I to
Yeah.
me, that is contrary to human experience, because I think people are motivated in self-defense. I think people will die and risk their lives to defend their own. But I think most of us are not naturally wired to go out and kill, die, or kill to help someone else. Am I? What do you think about that?
I think you're on to something. So I think there's both like two kind of false narratives about the Civil War. One is that it had nothing to do with slavery and it was all about states' rights.
Hmm.
And that's just like obviously not true.
Hmm. Hmm.
It definitely was about slavery. Um, and then the other narrative, right, is that it had nothing to do with states' rights
Yep.
and it was just about slavery,
Yep.
which is a less obviously wrong answer,
Yeah.
right? Like it's a more plausible answer. Like
Yeah.
kind of makes more sense.
Hmm.
But I think both of them miss the kind of real heart of what was happening. So one of the things that a lot of people don't talk about, you almost never hear about this, but prior to the Civil War, the Congress and the Senate. So remember, this included the southern and northern states at this time, right? Because we were all together. And they passed, and of course, we have to have super majorities to do this. We passed a constitutional amendment that would make an amendment put into the Constitution to allow for slavery. And it was
Mm.
kind of like the household rule law is essentially is that anything that happens within the household, right, is like the legal like authority of like whoever it is, right? Like, and so it's also interesting because at this time, right, a big hot question is polygamy, right, with like Mormonism and all this other kind
Mhm.
of stuff. So it actually also included, it would legalize um, polygamy as well, and it would legalize the ownership of slaves. And so we would put it in the Constitution, which
Mhm.
then, like, once it's in the Constitution, I
Mhm.
mean, like, you're never going to get rid of it, right?
No, right.
And it was passed by the House, it was passed by the Senate, it was signed by the president, and the Civil War broke out before enough state legislatures
Mm.
approved it. So this is what I say is that it was just about slavery. That can't be true because the North offered the ultimate
Yeah. Yeah.
olive branch. They're like, hey, you know what? If this is what you got, right, if this is what you guys need, like we'll give it to you, like forever, right? Like, I mean, you guys will be good. You can have your slaves in perpetuity.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and the Confederacy is like, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
Like that was not good enough for them.
Yeah.
And I think like a similar analogy is like with the Republican Party and like pro-life, right? And so like the key motivating like core political identity and motivation is to be pro-life. But here's the thing, just like in the Civil War, if we had an amendment added to the Constitution that forbid, abortions, right, in the United States, the Republicans still would not be satisfied, right? Because yes, that's a core fundamental like principle, but it's not the only thing they're fighting for because it's not like the difference is fighting for an issue versus an entire worldview and personal sovereignty, right? And there's two ways to get personal sovereignty, right? One is you take over the government, right? Then you are the sovereign, or you get to go make your own country. Those are the two options you get.
Mhm.
And so slavery wasn't just about having slaves. It was an entire social economic system that permeated down into the most minutia of Southern life.
Mhm.
And like another really hot topic issue at that time was like tariffs. So the South was really wanted no tariffs because
Mhm.
they were an export economy. And the
Mhm.
way that they gained all of their wealth is by selling cheap raw materials on the international market.
Mhm.
The worst possible thing you could do for that economy is to have tariffs.
Yep.
The North was a manufacturing economy, right? And so they wanted the tariffs in order to protect the growing industries of the North from cheap imports from Europe.
Mhm.
And so there was also, this kind of like massive division. Another important thing, and I think in the heart of hearts, I think this is the real reason why the Confederacy really happened. It wasn't about slavery per se, but it was about the freedom to expand slavery, not just throughout the United States, but throughout all of Latin America. What I think the Confederacy truly wanted, what they really wanted in their heart of hearts to fulfill the ultimate white man's burden was to colonize Latin America and turn it into a plantation south of the United States, to extend their culture and their way of life far beyond the borders of the US. That's, I think, what they really wanted. And a good concrete example of like what demonstrates this is one is like, that's why you want personal sovereignty, right? Because even if we were allowed to have slaves, there was zero chance that the South was ever going to convince the Union as a whole to invade Mexico and enslave Mexicans. That was never going to happen. That was
Mhm.
a non-starter, non-conversation, right? We weren't going to go and capture the European colonies in the Caribbean, which were mind-alteringly wealthy. I
Mhm.
mean, like during this time period, these were the wealthiest places in the world because they were so productive, because they use, I mean, how they produce that wealth is like the most horrible way possible, right? I mean, the slavery of the Caribbean, made like slavery in the United States look like a walk in a park. Um, because in the Caribbean, they imported only men, and then they would work them in gang chain, to the death. And like the average life expectancy was about 4 to 6 years
Mhm.
of like when slaves came. Like that level of extraction of human life for profit had been like perfected actually. And that's why they were so incredibly wealthy. And like the Confederacy, or at this time before the Civil War, it was the Southern states. The Southern states were like, well, they're in our backyard and they're defenseless. We should go take them. And
Mhm.
then we can run those plantations.
Yeah.
And that was never going to happen as long as they were a part of the Union. Like the full blossoming of Southern culture was never going to happen if they were still part of the Union. And so I think this is the real reason they split away. And by the way, after the Civil War, this is why many, many, many Confederate soldiers left the United States and went to Mexico to aid in the Civil War in Mexico, to overthrow the government and establish a monarch. They're like, well, if we, right, we failed
Mhm.
our project. Well, we'll just go join the Europeans who are like, well, if we can't take this new grand slave society from the Europeans, we'll just join them, right? And then we can get a piece of the pie, right? And so, like, I think it's much more deep and more profound than just merely even just states' rights or slavery. It was it was everything.
And th-
Like,
that make that makes sense to me. And so I guess when kind of getting back then to the war issue is in um and I think it really relates even to the drug war and the abortion issue. I'm not a fan of the just war idea. Not that and I think
what are
it's
your issues?
hmm?
What are your issues with it?
Well, number one, I don't think it works very well in practice. I think it's nice in theory, but what I think
Okay.
here's what here I'm kind of a
A lot of people
practical
say that.
yeah, I'm a practical person. So I look at kind of like the drug war. I don't I don't use drugs. I don't want any of my kids using drugs. I don't want anyone to use drugs. I don't want anyone to have an abortion. I don't but I also look at what
Which
is
is
the
what
cost?
most
Yeah,
people agree with that. Like most
yeah.
people are like, I don't want to have an abortion. I
Yeah.
don't want my kids to have abortion.
Yeah.
I don't use drugs. I don't want to use drugs. I
Yeah.
don't want my kids to
Yeah.
use drugs.
Yeah.
The overwhelming majority of people think that.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
like, but
It
now the question is, what do we do?
yeah. Well, it's sort of like is banning abortion the best way to accomplish our goal? Is a rigid enforcement of the drug war the best way to accomplish it? And I sort of make that same application to war is like to me,
Mhm.
war should be an absolute last resort because even under a just war theory, it's horrible. Like even under the best of circumstances, it's so horrible. Like the idea that people are going to go shed their blood, like a human life is going to die for some cause beyond themselves is a tragedy I have a hard time grappling with. And I, especially now, I have a son that's a Marine. You know, that whole like the cost, I don't even know how you quantify that. How many people died in the Civil War? A lot,
Yeah,
right?
it's over 500,000 people.
So
And
you
in
have
fact, not only is it over 500,000 people, more Americans died in the Civil War than every single war we have fought combined.
yeah.
That's
So
how gruesome and that was a time period when the population of the United States was a fraction. of the size it was today, right?
Yeah.
The and we always know historically, and this is just like a historical truth, right? Like civil wars are unimaginably more grotesque than
Mm.
any foreign war that has ever fought. That's
Yeah.
always true, irrespective of the culture you come from. So, and so this is, I think, is where a lot of people like really struggle with like just war or war, just like at all, or like a particular war, right? Because some people aren't necessarily thinking in such
Mhm.
abstract. They're just like this war, right? Like
Mhm.
this war is unacceptable because the human cost is so high, and it is just so evil, you know? Like it and the thing is I would say is like it's not just so evil, it is the most
Mm.
horrible, grotesque, barbaric, savage,
Yeah.
worst thing that human beings can do to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And by the way, like that's like really what war is, right? Is that like everything has every right, because we're as human beings, right? We talked about, right? We can't like being human is not just about being an individual, right? You can't understand your humanness as a person, right?
Mhm.
You're inseparable from your identity in the community, right? And so community requires dialogue and compromise and negotiations, right? And lots of people have very different priorities, and so, being a part of a community is hard, right? Um, but the reason we work so hard in terms of like dealing with, negotiation and dialogue and
Mm.
compromise and all these kinds of things, because if we stop talking, then we start killing each other
Mhm. Yep.
because the problems don't go away, right? The
Mhm.
conflict of human priorities don't go away because they're like, well, we're just not going to talk about it. I'm like, well, the problem's still there.
Mhm.
And so that leads to violence,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the ultimate mediator of human conflict is when we have to stop talking and we have to stop compromising, then we start killing each other. And and anybody who has I mean, even you can be like in the cushiest Western, protected place in the world, but like you've watched war documentaries, which are so PG, by the way. They're so PG. And it's horrifying,
Mhm.
right? Like you just even the small taste of war, right? Like it's just so gruesome. Um, and I think that like that natural reaction actually connects to what I talked about as like human nature, right? Like human beings, other than sociopaths, cannot conscientiously, intentionally kill strangers.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
can kill somebody who's wounded you personally,
Yeah. Right.
right? Like if your wife cheats on you,
Yep.
right? Like people can kill their wives and said boyfriend because it's personal.
Yeah.
This person did. But the idea of pulling out like your Glock and just like finding a random person on the sidewalk and then blowing their brains out, people can't do that.
Mhm.
Like we are genetically hardwired in our brains. It's like a fail safe, right? Like our brains just like it just stops. And like this is why in like the military you have like, trigger freeze, right? And of course like this happens even at like just normal part target practice. I actually had it happen to myself. Like, we were doing our gun drills and we're, out there, shooting, and I just got trigger freeze. And like I physically could not
Pull
keep
the
pulling
trigger.
the trigger,
Mhm.
even though I'm shooting a piece of plastic,
Mhm.
right? And it wasn't like I had a moral objection to shooting the plastic.
Yeah.
Right? It just like my brain stopped me from doing this, and I tried. I was like, like, I have to do this, right? And I was trying to make myself
Mhm.
I couldn't do it, and I
Mhm.
couldn't do it until my sergeant yelled at me to fire, and then immediately I pulled the trigger. And this actually gets into, like, basic training and, like, how we program human beings to become psychopathic murderers, right? That is the process that basic training does for human beings. About 99% of human beings can't consciously kill somebody as an individual. They can't look in your eye, and be like, "Yep, I'm gonna point, the gun at you. I'm gonna pull that trigger." They just can't do it. Now, some people might ask, like, "Well, then how did people die in war?" Right? Well,
Hmm.
it's accidents,
Hmm.
right? So people can't like I can't look at your face and just pull the trigger, but I can shoot over there,
Yeah.
right? Like, I can fire that direction,
Hmm.
right? And this is why, like, if you look in speaking of the Civil War, when we had soldiers, they'd all line up,
Line up, right.
chest to chest, and they get like within less than 100 yards of each other, and they're firing at each other. And
They're
most
not
people,
shooting at specific individuals. They're just shooting at the line, basically.
yeah. But here's the thing: most people ask, like, "Well, that's so dumb. Like,
Hmm.
why would so like
Yeah, it does.
that
It
seems like
sounds dumb. Yeah.
yeah, like you'd seem like the most basic general be like, "Hey guys, don't all clump up
Yeah.
together,
Yeah, that's right.
spread out a little bit
Yeah.
so you
Right.
don't die."
Right. Right.
But the reason they did that, and by the way, you'd have these two companies come together and they'd be shooting at each other at almost point blank range for like 8 hours. But that's how long it took these soldiers to kill, is because because
Mm.
another advantage of like old muskets is they create the fog of war. And the fog of war is literal. Like
Mm.
when you start shooting black musket,
Mm.
right, it creates
Smoke.
smoke.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very quickly where you're just shooting at a cloud,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And
Mm.
this is why we had to compact the soldiers so tightly together, is because if we spread them out, our
Yeah.
soldiers never hit anything.
That's right.
It was already basically impossible at point blank range, all stuff together. Almost none of the bullets got to the other side.
Hmm.
And by the way, like in terms of like military strategy, right? When you have a company, right, it takes about 10% casualty rate to cause a retreat psychologically. If you're in a combat zone and 10% of your
Mm.
group, is dead, it triggers
Mm.
this like mental, primordial reptilian thing, and you freak out,
Hmm.
right? You just,
Mm.
and you panic and you freak out. And so when you cause an enemy to retreat, that's usually all you have to do. Um, Now, part of the reason we have officers, right, in the military, um, is to keep your soldiers from retreating
Mm.
after they've received that
Mm.
many, death. And actually, this is why, like, so the word decimation, right? We've all heard this. So that comes from the Latin term, like, for 10, right? Like decade, right?
Mm.
And so it, to 10 a soldier is what they would do is that if soldiers like retreated in battle, what they would do is they would line up everyone who retreated and they would pull straws and they would execute one out of every 10 of the soldiers in that group.
Wow.
And what the idea was is that, okay, they understood that one way to help motivate soldiers is like we've always done, is like, if you don't fight, we'll kill you.
Yeah.
And by
Yep.
killing 1 out of 10, it produces the psychological trauma. So it's like you can't escape, right? Like, so what
Hmm.
it was is like you can't this emotion that you're trying to escape, you can't, because we'll create it for you,
Hmm.
right? So if you retreat because you're afraid of feeling these emotions, too bad, we're gonna make you feel those emotions. And they figured out you only have to kill about 1 out of 10
Hmm.
to like traumatize, soldiers in, and those traumatized soldiers help motivate the other soldiers to keep fighting. And it is what officers like primary job is to, to keep them going. I mean, that's why like in the military, even still today, in theory, like this is part of the officer class. This is why officers carry handguns,
Yeah.
because handguns are not a combat weapon.
Yeah.
They're a murder weapon.
Yeah.
And the reason officers have handguns is not to shoot enemy troops, it's to shoot their own troops. You know? Now because of modern training, right,
Mhm.
we actually have been able to overcome the psychological aversion for soldiers to retreat and to kill. And this is why, like, the death and also the PTSD, right? So one of the things about modern war is it creates PTSD, right? Like soldiers get real messed up. And that didn't happen until about World War One. And this is when we first started developing the primordial techniques of being able to brainwash soldiers into killing. Prior to that time period, what we call lethality rate, right? That's like the number of people who can like just look in somebody's eye and pull the trigger and just done. That was about 1% prior to World War One. By the time we get to World War Two, that's jumped up to 25%. That's really high, right? That's really high. Um, and
Why is
and
that?
so there's a couple things. One, we went back to the old Romans. So the Romans created a massive empire because they were really, really effective at killing people. Um, and I think it's probably indisputable that the success of the Romans comes from, and we see this with Marcus Aurelius's transformation of the military. Is one of the things is they create is the centurion and basically our modern sergeants. So before all the soldiers, so if you were like a sergeant equivalent in the Roman army, you used to fight with the other troops because the general's like, well, the more men fighting, the better, right? That makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, but they changed where the sergeant class they stopped fighting. They no longer fought,
Hmm.
and their only job was to tell Roman soldiers to kill, to attack, right? Hey, Craig, go do like kill that man, right? Kill him, do it. And that became their sole job. And this is why the Roman military transformed its whole battle tactics. And it's also why one of the reasons I believe that no other army was able to reproduce the military prowess of the Romans, because it wasn't just about the gear, right? You couldn't just get the weird, round shield, the short, gladius, and you're like, okay, well now we'll be as just as good as the Romans. It was like, no, and same thing too with the throwing spear. So one of the things they also found out, like throwing spear, and we figured this out in World War One, is that one of the ways to overcome humans' aversion to killing is have them kill at a distance,
Mhm.
right? Because then you don't have to look at the
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
You don't have to look at them because you're not stabbing a person. You're stabbing like an object.
Mhm.
And by the way, human mind only needs a little bit of plausible deniability to get over this aversion,
Mhm.
right? And it doesn't have to be big. And the other thing is with the sergeants, when they command you, it disperses your guilt, right? Because, oh, I'm not choosing to kill this person, right? Like it's not my right. What I'm about to do isn't my do. I didn't choose to do this. I have to do this. And we see from, like modern psychology tests, like how powerful, and the crazy things people are willing to do when they're told to do so, right? That's kind of the classic experiment, right? Like press the button, if somebody gets the answer wrong, right? And like people, it was all simulated, right? But they would get people to like electrocute people to death
Mhm.
just because they were told to do so.
Mhm.
Versus the people who, like, had to make the choice by themselves, they wouldn't do it.
Mhm. Hmm.
And so the same concept applies to the battlefield. And so one of the things we did in World War One is we created the sergeant class, right? And so their exclusive job was to tell you to kill.
Hmm.
And, that was not how the uncommissioned officers worked in the past. They were like traditional where they just fought with the troops.
Mhm.
They were just kind of like a senior soldier. But now we created them a new position where like, no, your job isn't to fight. Your job is to tell men to kill. And the other thing is we invented the rifle.
Mhm.
So the rifle, you can effectively shoot and kill somebody, 300 meters or more,
Mhm.
right? And we found that that's kind of like the magic number,
Mm.
like human psychology. When human beings are that far away, your aversion to shooting, like aiming directly at that person and pulling the trigger, is dramatically reduced. And I think it's also like, very interesting that like part of the Roman, soldiers is they had the spears. And so you would throw them at a great distance, right?
You didn't have to stick them with a sword, you could get some distance between you and
Yeah,
the
you can
target.
just lob it, right?
Yeah.
It's also why like archery was
Mm.
often so effective in ancient warfare because you don't have to look at the person.
Mhm. Mhm.
Another way we found is to overcome this aversion is to have multi-manned war machines. So in like the 1800s, one of the most effective ways to kill your enemies, right, was using cannons,
Mhm.
which is kind of weird because like if you actually look at like the mechanics of a cannon, they're not actually terribly good at killing people,
Yeah.
right? Like like a pure mathematical kind of
Mm.
assessment, you'd think these aren't going to work.
Mhm.
Like there's no like it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But what they found is that every cannon requires multiple people to operate.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's a guy who stuffs the cannon, there's a guy who aims it, there's a guy who lights it, right? And what happens is you become just like when the officer tells you to kill, you separate yourself from the guilt and you disperse it. Well, I'm not operating this cannon. Like Bobby over here, like I couldn't shoot this if he was doing this. And Fred over here is, doing this, right? And then like the thing that's doing the killing isn't even me.
Mm.
It's some other object. And so the reason cannons became very effective on the battlefield, I mean, this is part of like Napoleon and why he was able to explode and conquer so much of Europe, is because he fully utilized the power of cannons.
Mm.
Which, when those cannoneers point those cannons, they always hit target because there's not the moral hesitation to do so. It's the same thing with how we operated machine guns. So in World War One, most of the casualties that occurred on the battlefield that weren't disease oriented, because actually, like most wars, all the way up until like yesterday, most casualties are caused by disease,
Mhm.
right? Most people die because you're just sick,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's like,
Mhm.
before, modern antibiotics and
Mhm.
medicine, I mean, it's like disease, like petri dish nightmare in
Yeah.
army, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's gather men from all around the world and put them
Yeah.
in a tiny little space.
Yeah.
But that process allowed us to overcome the aversion. Now, we had a great revolution when we got to the Vietnam, which is also why Vietnam, because also very important, when you override the human instinct to not kill and you force them into it, it traumatizes the mind, right? You can kind of think of it like, right, like your arm naturally does not bend backwards, but I could force it to. What's going to happen? It's going to break your arm.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the mind, right?
Mhm.
When we force the human mind to do things that it is designed not to do, it breaks, right? And this is why we have the explosion of PTSD. Um, when we get to Vietnam, we have finally cracked this code. Before we were like learning, right? We were becoming more effective at killing and destroying and, convincing people to go out and destroy. But by the time we get to Vietnam, we've like really cracked the code. So that lethality rate from World War One went from 25% to 99% today. And that happened in Vietnam. That's when we unleashed our full spectrum of, training. And by the way, this is why if you look at the casualty ratio between like American soldiers died versus Viet Cong, who died. And I don't mean like in bombing and all that stuff, like, but just combat to combat, rifle on rifle, which in military terms, like it's you're kind of on equal ground, right? Like I have a gun and you have a gun and
Hmm.
shoot at
Hmm.
each other. Like
Yeah.
I don't have a natural like massive superiority, but the casualty rate was about 1 to 30. Why is that? Because the Viet Cong did not have the lethality training,
Mm.
and every soldier that was in the US Army pointed, shot, and killed. And so the casualty ratio was just mind alteringly like lopsided. We had never done this, but like, any war, like, killing your enemy 2 to 1, right, was considered like
Hmm.
a tremendous success.
Yeah.
I mean, you almost couldn't ask for more,
Yeah.
right? Like I mean, they take you in the street and parade you around and everyone would celebrate you're the greatest thing that's ever happened. But now we just blew past those ratios like out of the water.
Hmm.
And it's because of lethality training. So what happens after Vietnam War? Mountains of PTSD,
Mm.
right? I mean, probably most people at some point have met an untreated Vietnam vet who has PTSD at some time in their life. You've ran into one.
And you think, and I see the suicide rates and all that.
Yeah.
You think it's not simply that we just didn't treat it or recognize it, let's say after World War I and World War II. You think that there is, in fact, a much higher rate of that because of how we have altered the military training. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. That's exactly why. And it wasn't until rather recently. So it's kind of like the bomb, right? We figured out how to make the atomic bomb before we
Uh-huh.
discovered how to do nuclear energy,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? Because human motivation as it is, right? We always figure out how to break things before we can figure out how to put them
Yeah.
back together,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we figured out how to break the human mind before we figured out how to put it back together.
Hmm.
And so, especially out of Vietnam, like first of all, we didn't even like there was a lot of skepticism at that time. Not that everyone, like there was plenty of people who are like PTSD is like a real thing. Like well, this is how it occurs. But there was still kind of like a lot of like, I don't know. Is it really real? Like,
Hmm.
this is why we have like terms like shell shock,
Shell shocked. Yeah.
and war weary and, all these kind of like euphemisms, which basically like, or like weak nerves, like sometimes they'd call it, right? Like these are very amorphous, kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's just in your head, dude. Like just like shake it off. You know what I mean? Like you'll get over it. Um, and there also just wasn't a lot of knowledge about like the actual process and mechanics of trauma, right? So we also just didn't really understand it super well. And so we also obviously then didn't know how to treat it. And when soldiers came back to Vietnam, one of the things that shocks, and this is something that is emotionally very deeply connected to the conservative liberal divide today, is that, conservatives are like, this is when the liberals became unpatriotic, hateful, terrible anti Americans, is during Vietnam. Because for the first time, and this was true, the first time we welcomed soldiers back, and instead of like celebrating, right, like you're a war hero, like, and applause in the streets and celebration and, welcome home, son, like, you served your country, like all that. Like, and I've seen the videos of it, like where Vietnam soldiers come back, no ceremony, just like an incognito, like plane, right? Because they're basically trying to sneak back into America. And like these hippies found them and would just go out and like spit in their face and start, yelling and screaming at them. Nothing like that had ever happened before.
Do you
Like, this
think
was shocking.
so? Do you think it has anything to do with, and this kind of goes back to my hesitation on just war, is like when your cause is just, I think it's very easy to convince yourself to do things that are irrational because I'm on the right side. Like World War
In your
II.
head, you can.
Okay. I mean, World War II, for the most part, I mean, I don't know how much was drafted or whatever, but there was a lot of, we're going to go fight the Nazis. And so I think there was just general enthusiasm for that patriotism,
Oh,
but in like kind of the Korean War was sort of halfway between. But you get to Vietnam, and like people were drafted over. Like, who the hell wanted to go over? Like it wasn't like, well, we're excited to go over and save the Vietnamese the way it was. We're gonna go liberate Europe from the Nazis. Does that play into like the training that like you got to draft and send this guy to go over and fight in a war that no one wants to be part of? And then how does that factor in?
so I think this is a problem of a post hoc kind of like
Yeah.
perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, like when World War One, nobody wanted to go save
Yep.
the Frenchies.
Yep. Yep.
Like, let them burn.
Yeah.
Same thing with World War Two. No one wanted to go save the British. Let them drink their tea.
Yeah.
It's not my problem. I
Mm.
don't want to send my boys. I'm sure I don't want to go. Right? Like that's their problem. And America had always been very isolationist. You know, so that change in attitude is a change that happened after the war and also during the war, right? So it's very hard to convince people to go like to volunteer, like, hey, you know what? I think we should go kill those people. It's really hard to convince democratic societies that that's actually a good idea, even when the cause is just. They're like, yeah, but I don't want to pay for that, right? And but this because of the human psychology, right? It's very hard to convince us to go to war. But once the war has started, it's very hard to convince us to stop it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So once we declared war on, during World War One or World War Two, sentiment started to rapidly change, right? Where to the by the end, right? Like, I mean, it was downright practically treasonous if you were against, the war against the Nazis.
Well,
But that's a
it,
process of being in war, not a process of thinking about the war.
although with World War II, I mean, are you where are you on the theory about how much we welcomed Pearl Harbor? I mean, Pearl Harbor obviously
I
changed things.
I think it was an intentional accident.
So
I
what do you mean
think
by that?
what I mean by that is that FDR needed a reason to go and fight his war.
Yep.
And obviously we don't know, but I think they're like the whole Pearl Harbor thing is like conspiracy theory like levels of like what
Yeah.
the hell?
Yeah.
Like it really seems like FDR knew Pearl Harbor was coming and he said, "Okay, get the important things out.
Yep.
The aircraft, right? Right, we're going to do a false flag operation and like we can't do it ourselves, right? Like we can't
Yeah.
bomb, right?
Right.
Because that's crazy. Also, we
Right.
wouldn't get away with it.
Right.
But
Right.
they probably got intelligence that the Japanese were going to do this. And so they're like, hey, get the aircraft carriers out ASP because we are not going to start a war without those.
Mm-hmm.
And like leave Pearl Harbor empty.
Mm-hmm.
And then the patrols that are supposed to be like, hey, we're under attack, like just have them spontaneously not send out the signal until it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that like it was an intentional accident, right? They're like, and we have that kind of thing in our own personal lives, right? Like somebody's up to no good, but you're like, I'm gonna let them get away with it because then that will give me the justification to do anything I want to them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it was with our relationship. Because again, it gets to that psychology. Like FDR was the most pro-war president like Americans could have elected, but America was not
Mm-hmm.
with this idea. They were
Yeah.
super against it.
Mm-hmm.
And he understood human psychology. Like, I have to have a rationalization to go do what it is I already want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he got this opportunity and was like, hey, here's the perfect opportunity. Like, let's let it happen.
Yeah. That seems very
Uh,
plausible to me too.
Yeah.
Mm.
And you know what? Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe that's all just, it was an act of God and stuff like that. But I don't think whether it was an intentional accident or not matters really in the end of the
Mm-hmm.
story, right? Because it did happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's indisputable. And that was the justification to convince the
Mhm.
otherwise very anti-war American, because again, because now it wasn't like Americans weren't declaring war against Japan and the Nazis. And by the way, we didn't actually declare war against the Nazis. The Nazis declared war against us.
Yeah,
We
right.
didn't declare war against the Japanese. The Japanese declared war on us
Yep.
by attacking our military base.
Yeah.
And so now we're already in war. So it's like, okay, well, are we going to
Yeah.
defend ourselves?
Yeah. Yep.
That's something that human beings really like get on board with.
Yeah. People will defend themselves. Like that's what I've always thought.
Oh,
I think you can get someone to defend themselves.
it's very easy.
Mhm.
Um, And so that's what like caused the war. And it's the same thing with Vietnam. I mean, that we know was a false flag operation,
Yep.
right? Like that, I mean, we have the evidence for it.
Yeah.
But again, it was that same thing, right? Like, and especially for democratic people, right? So if you're an authoritarian to society, it's actually relatively easy to convince people to want to go to war because the whole purpose and ethos of an authoritarian society is that we create a militarized authoritarian state so that we can take
Mhm.
by force things from other people.
Yeah.
That's the whole rationale. So, also, too, in an authoritarian society, you don't have to convince the ordinary people. You just have to convince the people on the top who have the most to gain and the least to pay. It's a lot easier to convince them to be like, hey, I think a war, in Poland would be great. Like, let's go invade Poland. That
So,
seems like a brilliant idea. We'll take all their stuff. And if there's too many people in Poland, we'll just get rid of them.
mm, well, I want to take the I want to take the 15 minutes I have here,
Yeah.
and because I got to segue to Ukraine because
Yeah.
I've
Ukraine.
seen I, I'm not sure exactly what your position is on Ukraine, but I kind of have a sense for it because I have a heart. I mean, I struggle with what to do with Ukraine in part because I see, the things we talked about with Pearl Harbor and all this, and I'm not a 9/11 truther, but I think that the US saw or could have predicted the terrorist attack because I think they sort of wanted us to go there. What's your overall impression of Ukraine? Because the most I would say about Ukraine is it just breaks my heart that people are dying, whether it's Russians or Ukrainians or anyone. Like to me, just war always seems like such a senseless thing, even if the cause is just. And to the extent that it was foreseeable or predictable, and because for geopolitical reasons we thought it would be good that it happened, that is a big barrier for me to get past if that's what was going on. And it's hard for me to think
Well,
that
I'd say
it,
with the Ukraine,
yeah,
we had nothing to do with this. The Ukrainians decided they want to have this war.
yeah, I don't think
And I
that's
think that's
right.
an important context. Like, we as Americans, like, we like to think that we control everything, we pull all the strings, which, by the way, we do pull a lot of strings and we do control a lot of things. So I mean, like, it's not like nothing's our fault, right? Um, but most of what goes on in the world, we have nothing to do with. And particularly with whether or not Ukraine was going to fight the Russians, that was 100% on them.
I don't How do you say that? I mean,
Well,
what about
I'll give an
the
example of the president.
yeah,
So the Joe Biden begged Lazinski to leave Ukraine, as well as the European other countries. They're like, hey, the Russians are literally pouring over your border. Like, they're gonna capture you. Like, you should leave the country. And Lazinski said no. That was the choice right there. Because what Lazinski, by staying there, is he says that we are not going to accept this military incursion. We are going to declare war, right? We are going to fight for our lives. And I'm going to be here right on the front line, right? I'm going to fight. Like, look, if I'm going to put myself like they're coming for Kyiv, right? Like, and I'm going to be the first one they execute once they capture this city, right? And I'm staying right here. I'm not going anywhere. And that was the choice of the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians alone. right?
isn't that
Fight that
isn't
war.
isn't that
Because they
like
could easily just be like, you know what? Let the Russians come. We don't want to fight a war. It's not worth it. We'll just do it like, when the Nazis went into Austria and they just like, oh no, we're invaded. Anyways, I guess we're German now.
yeah, but that feels like pretending or acting like World War II started the moment Pearl Harbor was bombed and not the events that may or may not have led up to that. Because you're familiar with the 2014 election slash coup where the West was basically helped overthrow whoever was elected president, who was a very pro-Russian
Allegedly.
president. Well, I don't know how allegedly is. It
Look, it's
was it
allegedly,
Noonan or whoever caught on tape? I
and
mean, I
I'm
guess
not, look, I don't, nobody knows the facts, right? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't, probably not, but that, like, irregardless, right? Like, so, I mean, that's like saying, if conservatives in Canada, thought that Donald Trump really did get elected and the election was stalled, that's a justification for the Canadians to invade the United States. It's not. Okay. And just in the same way that, when any other coup happens in another country, that's not it like, oh, okay, well, now we have the right to invade that country because we don't like the corrupted election. And that's even when it is clear, or at least you believe so, right? Because nations have their own sovereignty,
Mhm.
right? They get to determine their outcome of their society. And just because a country chooses to do something that you don't like, right, does not mean that gives you a right to invade that country. It
Yeah.
doesn't.
Well, and I think so. So that's where I think here's where I think it's so messy and where I personally struggle. Like I get that. Like it's like because I don't know what to I don't know how to square this because I am not defending Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. I mean it's clearly immoral. I'm not even opposing Ukraine's right to defend itself, but I can't just eliminate the circumstances that led up to that and perhaps made the war, which could have been avoidable, unavoidable. And because I have such an abhorrent reaction to war, even if the cause is just, like if it's avoidable, I think we should avoid every just war if it can be avoided. Like that's my general philosophy. And it seems like oftentimes we most people don't support the idea of even a just war should be avoided if possible. I think that's where I'm different, maybe
Here's
different
I
from.
think here's I think where, like, example we see with like Ukraine and Russia war, right?
Mhm.
Which, by the way, is very similar to Hamas and Israel, right? Um, is that you ask them like, well, we should do everything to like help overcome and prevent war. It should be the last resort. Well, the reason these things had to go to the last resort is because Russia fundamentally believed Ukraine doesn't exist. And the Ukrainians fundamentally believe that Ukraine exists. That is the irreconcilable difference. And it's not something that can be mediated, right? So if they had a difference in like trade policies or something like that, right? We could kind of negotiate like, well, I'll give you some da 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 da. But like Putin believes Ukraine's not a real country.
Yeah, see, that's where that's where I think you're wrong. I mean, I
He
think
said so. So I think this is important. So like he has, just before he like launched the invasion, he gave a famous speech where he explicitly says this. He's
well,
serious.
yeah, but he's also
Not
said he was
real.
afraid of NATO expansion, but we're supposed to just disregard that. Like that, I I think here. So I think it is irrational. Like I don't, and maybe Putin's irrational. Like I'm okay with that.
He is.
But I'm skeptical that someone like that is irrational because the idea that he would invade a country because of some philosophical belief that it doesn't exist was the reason, and not because he rightly or wrongly thought that NATO was going to expand, and if he didn't take out Ukraine, the NATO was going to be on his doorstep, and that was an existential threat to Russia. I mean, that seems far more plausible to me than that Putin is irrational. I mean, again, I'm willing to be wrong here, but when people tell me that you need to ascribe irrational motives to someone, I'm just, to me, that is really hard for me to 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 embrace when there are other, what I think are more plausible explanations, but I don't know.
Yeah. So I think with like, it's like, are they irrational, right? So dictators usually are irrational. This
Mm,
is like this big myth that's out here, right? That dictatorship, well, that's when we have a rational leader. And that's just not true. In fact, it's actually dictatorships that are the most prone to irrational behavior. And there's a couple reasons for that. The most basic one is that decisions are made by principally an individual. And how you create and structure an authoritarian society is through lies, secrecy, and exclusion of information.
mhm,
And you can't build that system and as dictator have access to like authentic information. And also too, all these authoritarian societies are built on, because again, this is what like the rationale for having an authoritarian leader, right, is some kind of fascistic worldview. Now, there are a couple important components about the fascistic worldview. Is one, you have to believe in a mystical past. And it's mystical because it's not real, right? And that somehow that mystical past was taken away from you, right? And you rightfully deserve it. And if you just give the right man the power, you can achieve this mystical past that you have lost. And Putin's, I mean, goes back to Putin's hardcore beliefs, right? Like he said that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, and there's a long list of political disasters in the 20th century. I mean, it's a long list. He said was the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
mhm.
And this is another thing too, is that like as Democrats, and I don't mean that like as in the Democratic Party, but like people like democratic people, small d Democrats, we are under the assumption that politicians like just say stuff and they don't mean it, right? They just, they get out a bumper sticker and they just say the pretty words to like appease people, and we just expect that, right? We don't take seriously the words of politicians. Problem is, all authoritarians have this in common. They tell you like it is. Like, so when Putin says, right, that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he means it. It's just like this is how we elected Hitler, right? Hitler is like, well, we should kill all the Jews and, take over Europe and create a pure Aryan race. And people are like, he doesn't mean that, right? Like, that would be crazy, right? And yet, when he gets into power, that's exactly what he does.
Well, I think it's one thing to say. I mean, uh, anytime someone compares anyone to Hitler, I just, my skepticism goes up, because I mean, I'm not saying Putin or anyone else, Assad over in Syria can't be irrational. Kim Jong Un, whatever, maybe they are. I don't know. I mean, I think it's far more likely that you have ruthless people that are rational, know what they're doing, um, than they're just crazy. I mean, to me, that's
Well, I'll take the example of like Hitler, right? And I actually do use this because he's a good working print of like how we can understand dictatorship, or say the emperor of Japan. And because we can actually use this analogy for every dictatorship. So when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, that was totally irrational, right? It was absolutely mad,
Mhm.
you know. They had no chance of defeating the United States
So why did they do it?
because they were desperate and they
Yeah,
were crazy.
yeah.
They're
Well,
crazy. And this
that's
this is the thing too, like when you have this mystical past, because like the Japanese believed they should conquer all of Europe and colonize it, right? And they knew that there was one thing stopping them from doing that. That was the United States, ultimately. So the United States had to go. But of course, they had no chance of defeating the United States. But here's the thing: it is better for them to try to achieve their fantasies
mhm.
and fail, even though it's so obvious you're going to fail, right? And you actually see this in like children sometimes, right? Like where like they are just like, I am going to climb to the top of that tree, and it's like, no, you're not. Like the first branch is 10 feet up. There's no way, and they'll jump up and they'll try to climb, like I mean they'll go crazy,
Yeah.
and it's like, why is that? Because they have the fantasy in their head, and so everything has to be determined by that worldview. It's the same thing when Hitler, attacked the Soviet Union. It was crazy. It's the same thing like when he declared war on the United States. Like America would have been happy just to have fought a war against Japan and defeated the Japanese
Mhm.
and just let bygones be gone bygones in Europe. But Hitler declared war on us. That was insane. That was mind-alteringly dumb.
Mhm.
And I don't mean that in the like, well, plausibly, the Nazis could have done like, no, just the most basic war strategist would have been like, no way. Like the United States, produced half of all the manufactured goods on Earth, and you want to like attack them
Mhm.
in a war that's defined by how many manufactured goods you can produce, or attacking the Soviet Union, the largest country in the world, and also the only source of oil that, the Nazis had, and who we had an alliance, and that no country has ever been able to conquer, and would take mind-alteringly huge amounts of resources to attack. It was a crazy
Yeah,
concept.
I think Hitler was insane. Like you're not I'm not arguing that Hitler was
Yeah.
insane. I just don't think that everyone that does things is insane. Like
Most dictators are insane
mm,
because
I don't know,
you have
maybe.
all the power in the world and everyone around you lies to you, and you have that your level of egotism,
Mhm.
is unreal. And so you live in a fantasy world.
Yeah.
And this is what makes dictators go crazy. And it's also why like
Or
because here's the thing.
politicians in general.
Well, no, it's actually very different. Most in democracies, politicians are weak and people pleasers, right? They're brown nosers,
Mhm.
right? They do whatever you know, people want them to do,
Mhm.
right? And they're willing to just spout out whatever words
Yeah.
that like make people feel happy,
Yeah.
right? Like they're inherently like
They're
they have
wind
more problem
socks.
with
Yeah.
prostitutes,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Where they're just like anything you want, like I'll do it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Mhm.
Because they have like they're an empty shell,
They have no principles. Yeah.
no principles.
Mhm.
And this is where we see is like dictators, like they create. And look at something like Hamas, right? So Hamas is a dictatorship. There's no democracy there whatsoever. And they attacked Israel in a vicious, brutal, systematic fashion.
Mhm.
They knew for a fact that the Israel was gonna attack them.
Mhm.
The Israeli army is like magnitudes more powerful than they are. They knew that tens of thousands of children in Gaza would die in their war, and that they had zero chance of winning this war. And it would basically make Gaza Strip into like a suicide bomber. And they're like, yeah, that's what we want. That's not a rational action. That's
Di-
a we have to achieve our fantasy or we die. We die trying. And that's the whole ethos of dictatorship and other fascistic regimes is that it's better for them all to die and everyone around them to die if they can't make their fantasies come true. And this is why the world is not run by rational but ruthless men. Because if such men existed, they would rule every nation on earth.
Mhm.
But they don't exist, and that's why democracies run the world.
Mhm.
That's the paradigm that we live in.
Well, I'm running up to my
Yeah, we are kind of running out of
self-appointed
time.
deadline,
Yeah.
and um,
It's an
okay,
intriguing conversation, I think.
yeah, I really have appreciated the conversation. In because it is something that it's a I would say it's the political issue that concerns me the most.
Yeah. And a lot
It,
of people, lots of
yeah,
people.
but I think for a lot of people, it's a conversation that's really difficult to have because our
Is
current political environment sort of doesn't allow
because
for.
death
Yeah,
because death is hard to talk about,
yeah,
right? And whatever the thing is, like death is, we were talking about that safety switch in our mind, right? Like we have conversations about war and violence, right? Like it starts activating that, like, I don't want to talk about this because
yeah.
it's so horrible.
Hmm.
And I would probably have to lead with this, right? Is that in scripture, right? It says that the authorities do not bear the sword in vain,
Mm.
right? If you wish to be well with the authorities, then do good, right? Because they are against the evil ones. And this is the whole mindset of like, just in the way that God has authority over life and death, he has given that authority to the state. And the state is the mediator of God's morality here on earth. And this is why, like, when we have a good nation, it feels like we're in heaven. And when we have a wicked nation, it feels like we're in hell. Um, and I think it's important also to realize, like, just because someone has the authority over life and death, which the state does not mean that its usage of that authority is good, right? You know, that is basic concept. Like just because you can doesn't mean you should,
Hmm.
right? We talked about the drug war. Just because we can round up all these people and throw them in
Hmm.
prison doesn't mean it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Um, and it's the same thing with war. Just because we can, nuke every country back into the Stone Age doesn't mean it's a good idea for us to do so.
Hmm.
And and I think this is also why, because this is so hard, in our system of government, we don't allow the people to decide how war is done,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Because war is like the democratic mind is inherently averse to warfare. And yet warfare is the only thing that keeps peace and stability and prosperity in the world. Because here's the thing, why does war have to be so horrible? Because human beings are so horrible. Right? It's a just like we have to go through purgatory to get to heaven, war is the purgation of sin out of the world. And so when we look at how horrible war is, it should be a reflection to ourselves of how horrible our sins are. That we have to then purge ourselves of our own wickedness. Um, and that's also too is like this is so hard. This is why we put almost all of the powers of the military into one man's hand, in the executive. Um, because like when you are the executive, you have to make the unimaginably hardest choices. And that is just in the same way that soldiers on the battlefield don't want to feel culpable for pulling that trigger, we as citizens of our country don't want to be culpable for sending soldiers out to die or to whomever they kill. We don't want
Hmm.
to have that blood on our hands, right?
Yeah.
We want to be like Pontius Pilate, right? And wash our hands clean. But of course, you can't wash your hands clean, right? I mean, that's the whole problem with Pontius Pilate. He thinks he can get away with it.
Hmm.
Um, and so, um, you know, that is always hard conversation to have. Um, is that like, but like I said, I think like remembering that like whatever our objections are to war, right? We can have, I think there's good objections to have, like how we fight wars, right? Because wars can be fought very, immorally.
Mhm.
Um, and we need to like have opinions about like what wars are good and whether it's going well. But ultimately, we have to realize that like this moral authority over life and death is not in our own hands. It's in the hands of the president. And he has been chosen by God to exercise this ultimate power of life and death. And that's a grace that God gives to every sovereign, right? Now, that doesn't mean he's holy, right? I mean, Hitler had the same grace, right? And he, just like we talked about, like, grace doesn't make you a good person, right? It makes you
Mm.
capable of great holiness
Mhm.
or great wickedness. And ultimately, I think it's important to realize, like, when it comes to our conscience, right? Like, not to be overburdened on our personal conscience. Like, ultimately, like the real person who will be judged for the justness or injustice of a war is your sovereign, right? Like they are going to have to pay for what they've done in eternity.
Yeah, I mean, like it or not, that's the reality. And I guess my final parting thoughts are this: is that at least in the past few elections, I always felt like there was someone, generally not one of the two key primary candidates, that kind of had the values, the character that I thought would be good. Unfortunately, now I feel very ambivalent about the whole thing because I don't have confidence in any of
You and
the
most
remaining.
Americans.
Yeah, and so it's hard for me to get excited about politics when I just
Animal.
because I do think I think as Catholics for too long we've just undertreated this issue, this moral issue for forming our voting conscience because just of the priority we've given to abortion, rightly or wrongly. And I would hope that maybe this year maybe is an opportunity for us to look at things a little differently and hopefully give some priority. Maybe we'll get you back on here and further into the campaign season. We see what's going on, but I do have to go, so I
Yeah,
appreciate.
absolutely understandable. Yeah, yeah. So I would like, what I just like that last thing I'd leave, right? Is that like the ugliness of war is the purgation of the ugliness of our sins, right? And just as we like, meditate, right, on heaven, war is a kind of meditation on purgatory and hell, right? And I think that also, like in dealing with the abortion issue, like is a reminder to ourselves of like how real human brokenness is, and that broken people, right, can sometimes be mended back together, but often they cannot be.
Mhm,
And so that's why we have the chaff thrown into the fire. And war is a foreshadowing, right, of the cost of sin, um, in all of us, right? Because like no war is one person's fault,
mhm,
right? War always happens because of sins on both sides,
mhm.
right? And we may be the just ones and we may have the right to fight this war, but we should not ever take like glee and
Yeah,
joy in the
I
fact that we're
agree.
fighting a war,
Mhm,
because it's the ultimate failure of human love,
mhm.
right?
Yep,
Which, is
totally
like that's
agree.
what we're supposed to bring into the world.
Yep, totally agree. Well, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate
Absolutely.
this.
God bless you, and good luck with your jury duty. And yeah, well, and thank you for having me on again.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for everyone for listening, and until next time, everyone, have a good one.
Absolutely. Bye, everybody.